A Florida homeowner opens a property tax bill and finds a line item they can't explain. It isn't a mistake, and it isn't an HOA fee. It's a bond payment for infrastructure built years before that homeowner ever signed a closing document issued by a government most residents don't know exists. That government is called a community development district. Florida has more than 1,000 of them, spread across master-planned communities from Lakewood Ranch to Celebration to Vera to the Villages. Each one borrows money and builds the roads, the drainage, and the water lines for a town that doesn't have any residents in it yet, then hands the bill to whoever moves in once the concrete's dry. This is the machine underneath the golf courses and the town squares, and it decides who pays for all of it and for how long. Most towns earn their infrastructure. A factory opens, a port gets dredged, a highway exit gets built, and people follow. The roads get paved a little wider each decade. The water lines get extended block by block, and the city or the county sells its own bonds against tax revenue already coming in from people who already live there. Florida's retirement mega communities ran that sequence backward. Nobody drove out to empty pasture and slowly built a town around a reason to stay. Someone built the finished town first, roads, drainage and all, size for a population that hadn't arrived yet, then sold it to people who wanted somewhere finished to move into. And it wasn't the county's money that paid for it. That takes a specific kind of financing. A county can't easily issue general obligation bonds to build roads and sewer lines for land that has no taxpayers on it yet, and voters in that county have little reason to approve borrowing for a project a private developer will profit from. Florida's answer showed up in 1980 in a piece of state law most residents have never read, and most homeowners never think to ask about. It's called the Community Development District. A community development district isn't a homeowners association, and it isn't a marketing label a builder invented. It's a real government, chartered under Florida law, with the power to borrow money and tax property inside its own boundaries. It can build the roads, water systems, and drainage a growing community needs, years ahead of the people who'll eventually live there. It exists specifically so a developer never has to ask a county to take on the debt or the risk. Counties liked this deal for their own reasons too. A CDD's bonds aren't backed by the county's own credit, so a county can wave a huge new development through without adding a single dollar to its own bonded debt. That kept the county's borrowing capacity free for its own roads and schools. The growth still happened, and the county still collected regular property taxes on top of it once the homes were sold. So the whole thing comes down to 3 questions. What is this government actually allowed to do? Who's running it while the concrete is still wet? And who's holding the bill when it finally hands itself over? The law behind this is Chapter 190 of the Florida Statutes, passed in 1980 as the Uniform Community Development District Act. The statute defines a community development district as a local unit of special purpose government, and that phrase is doing real work. It means a CDD isn't a general government like a city or county, free to do whatever local government normally does. It's limited to a specific list of jobs written directly into the law. Chapter 1, 190 also does something less obvious, but just as important. The legislature made it the exclusive method for creating this particular kind of independent district. If a developer wants a government that can issue bonds and levy assessments the way a CDD can, Chapter 190 is the only door available, and every district in the state walks through the same one. Once a city, county, or the state grants that charter, the district becomes a real legal entity. It can sign contracts, own land, sue and be sued, borrow money, issue bonds, and levy assessments on the property inside it. Because Florida treats it as a government, It also carries sovereign immunity within statutory limits, the same protection cities and counties get. And because it's a government and not a company, it picks up obligations a homeowners association never has to deal with. Its board meetings have to be open to the public and announced ahead of time under Florida's Sunshine Law, and its records have to be available for anyone to inspect. The full list of powers in Chapter 190 works like a menu, not a requirement. Every district's actual authority gets narrowed down in its own establishing ordinance, the document that chartered it in the first place. One district might handle roads, drainage, and lighting and nothing else, while another takes on water, sewer, and fire protection too. Where the statute sets the outer boundary, the ordinance decides what a specific district is actually built to do. But the power is bounded, and the boundary is the entire point of the statute. Chapter 190 lists exactly what a CDD is allowed to build and run: water management and drainage, water supply and sewer systems, roads and street lighting, certain parks and recreation facilities, and in some districts, fire protection or added security. What it can't do matters just as much. A CDD has no police power and no general zoning authority. It can't write the land use rules, and it can't put a deputy in a patrol car. Those stay with the county or the city, the way they always have. Hold on to that line, because one community in this story pushes right up against it. Florida has leaned on this tool harder every year. A recent compilation counted 1,088 development-style special districts statewide, 1,067 of them CDDs, more than a 50% jump since 2020. Back in 2012, researchers counted 575. To put that number somewhere you can feel it, Florida now has more of these development districts than it has incorporated cities and towns. In a little over a decade, the number of these governments has nearly doubled, which means the machinery behind a place like the Villages isn't an unusual edge case anymore. It's become the default way Florida builds a large planned community from scratch. A charter and a list of powers don't pour a single foot of road. The part that actually gets shovels in the ground is money, and the money is where this stops being a legal technicality and starts being genuinely inventive. A CDD doesn't ask the county to borrow on its behalf, and it doesn't wait for tax revenue to build up first. It sells its own bonds directly to investors before most of the people who'll eventually live there have even heard of the place. These are called special assessment revenue bonds, and they're tax exempt, the same as a city's municipal bonds. But they're secured by something narrower than a city's full faith and credit. They're backed only by the assessments the district plans to collect from the properties inside its own boundaries. The county's credit is never on the hook. The city's credit is never on the hook. If the assessments come up short, the risk sits entirely with the district itself. The district uses the bond money to build the roads, the stormwater systems, the utilities, and the amenities the community needs. Then it spends the next 20 to 30 years paying that debt back through assessments charged to the properties that benefit from it. Call the structure what it actually is: a government built specifically to take on debt. A private developer would otherwise have to carry a loan, which then hands the repayment to the people who move in afterward. None of that is a hidden trick. It's stated plainly in the bond documents, and it's exactly how the law designed it to work. If a system like that reads as fascinating to you rather than alarming, that's most of what this channel does. Subscribe, and I'll keep opening them up. But here's what makes this different from a normal city bond. Who decides how much debt to take on and when isn't a question residents get to weigh in on, not at first. In the earliest years of a district's life, its board is elected the way a private company's board would be: 1 acre, 1 vote, based on land ownership. Since the developer owns nearly all the land at that point, The developer effectively controls the district and controls the decision to borrow the money in the first place. That control question turned out to have federal stakes. In 2013, the IRS took a hard look at the Village Center Community Development District, one of the village's commercial districts, and concluded it wasn't really a political subdivision at all. The reasoning came down to control. The board answered to the landowner, and the landowner was the developer, which meant no meaningful public accountability had ever attached to it. And if a district isn't a political subdivision, its bonds don't get the federal tax exemption that made them cheap to issue in the first place. The dispute ran on for years. What it put a spotlight on is a question most homeowners in these communities never think to ask, which is who exactly is voting on their behalf. That control reshapes everything else about how this system works. The people voting to issue the bonds, set the debt schedule, and design the infrastructure aren't the people who'll spend the next 2 or 3 decades paying it off. The residents who move in later inherit a fully engineered financial structure they had no vote in creating. When that structure finally shifts into their hands is its own story, and it takes longer than most buyers assume. The more immediate question is simpler. If a resident is paying off debt they never voted on, for infrastructure built years before they arrived, what does that actually look like on their bill every year? It's a specific number, calculated by a specific formula, and it shows up on every property tax statement inside a CDD twice. Every property inside a CDD carries 2 separate charges, and they behave completely differently from each other. One is fixed, the other moves. The first is the debt service assessment, the resident's share of paying back the bonds that built the infrastructure. It follows the bond's amortization schedule, so it's fixed for the life of the debt, the same way a mortgage payment is fixed once you sign for it. The second is the operations and maintenance assessment, the annual cost of actually running everything the district owns: landscaping, street lighting, drainage upkeep, insurance, administration, and reserves for future repairs. That one gets set fresh every year through a public budget hearing, so it moves up and down depending on what the district actually needs to spend. The debt piece isn't a flat number applied evenly to every home. It's calculated according to a specific formula. The district divides the total bond cost by the total assessable acres in the district. Then it multiplies that by the acres in a given phase and divides by the number of lots in that phase. In the villages, that's the actual math used to figure out what each individual lot owes toward the bonds that built its section of the community. A bigger lot in a smaller phase carries a bigger share, and the result is impersonal but not arbitrary. These assessments aren't based on what the home is worth either, which is what makes them different from a normal property tax. They're non-ad valorem, meaning the charge is tied to the infrastructure benefit a property receives, not its market value. A modest home and a much larger one in the same phase of the same district can end up owing close to the same debt assessment because they're paying for the same road and the same drainage system, not for the value of what sits on top of it. Other CDDs weight the math differently, spreading the cost using something called an equivalent residential unit. It's a way of scoring different housing types and lot sizes against a single standard unit. So a condo and a single-family home each carry a fair share of the same bond. The formula changes from district to district. The underlying idea, that the assessment tracks the benefit received rather than the sale price, doesn't. There is a way off the debt portion of that bill, and a surprising number of residents live inside a CDD for years without ever learning it exists. Many districts let a homeowner prepay the remaining bond balance in full, principal plus any accrued interest and a prepayment premium. Once that's done, the annual debt assessment disappears from the tax bill for good. The operations and maintenance charge keeps going regardless, because someone still has to pay for the landscaping and the drainage upkeep every single year. Because these assessments run with the land, anyone who buys a home in a CDD before the bonds are paid off inherits whatever balance is left, whether they ever think to ask about it or not. In some communities, the developer has already prepaid a chunk of that capital assessment before the first sale closes. A buyer of a newer home can end up inheriting a smaller remaining balance than the original construction cost would suggest. None of that shows up on the sticker price of the house. Real estate guidance around communities like Lakewood Ranch tells buyers to add the annual CDD charge on top of the mortgage payment, the regular property tax, any HOA dues, insurance, and utilities. Only after adding all of that up does a home's true monthly cost become clear. Skip that step, and two homes that look identically priced on a listing page can carry very different real costs once the assessment shows up. And it's all findable before anyone signs anything. The county property appraiser's record for a parcel lists the non-ad valorem assessments attached to it, and the district publishes its own budget every year. Between those two documents, a buyer can see the exact annual charge, how much of it is fixed debt, and how many years are left on it. Nobody is hiding this. It's just sitting one search away from a listing page almost nobody clicks through to. None of this makes a CDD a bad deal by itself. It's the same trade every homeowner makes with local government. You pay in, and you get roads and drainage and lighting back out. The difference is that a CDD's bill is a separate, specific, calculable line most new residents have never had explained to them, for infrastructure designed and financed years before they showed up. So when does the government stop belonging to the developer? Not on any single day, it turns out, and the handoff is slower than the brochure version suggests. Florida law starts the clock 6 years after the district's initial board is seated, and only once at least 250 registered voters actually live inside its boundaries. A district that's still mostly vacant land doesn't have the electorate to hand anything over to yet. Even when the threshold is met, the whole board doesn't change hands at once. Seats convert to resident election in stages across successive election cycles until eventually every supervisor is someone who lives there. And for the largest districts, the ones over 5,000 acres, the clock doesn't start until year 10. Day to day, none of this runs itself. The 5-member board of supervisors sets the direction, adopting budgets, levying assessments, approving contracts, and issuing bonds when new debt is on the table. A professional district manager, usually from a firm that specializes in this kind of work, handles the actual operations underneath that. That means building budgets, coordinating maintenance and capital projects, keeping the district compliant with state reporting rules, and serving as the person residents actually call when something needs fixing. In communities built from a whole stack of these districts, there's often a layer above the individual district too. Lakewood Ranch created an inter-district authority that runs a shared town hall and provides administrative, financial, and operation support across all of its member districts. Each district sends one representative to sit on it. It functions like a coordinating body for governments that would otherwise all be operating separately. Florida's Sunshine Law requires community development district meetings to be open to the public, and that requirement doesn't switch on later either. It applies during the developer-controlled years just as much as after residents take over the board. Compare that to a homeowners association where board decisions can happen with far less public visibility, and the community development district is the more transparent of the two by a wide margin. A resident who wants to know why an assessment went up or what a district spent its reserve fund on can walk into a meeting and ask. The answer is a matter of public record either way. Still, Researchers who've studied this model point to a real structural tension in those early developer-controlled years. A 2012 academic analysis of community development districts described them as carrying built-in accountability problems, precisely because the people voting to take on debt and approve infrastructure spending in the first several years aren't the people who'll eventually be paying it off. That's not an accusation of wrongdoing. It's a description of an incentive. A developer racing to finish a build-out has reason to move fast and borrow enough to get it done. The residents who inherit that decision don't get a vote on it until the district has already been running for years. So the government does eventually become genuinely resident-run, open meetings and all. But by the time that handoff finishes, the roads are paved, the bonds are sold, and the debt schedule is locked in. And the place that shows this entire structure working at its largest, most layered scale is the one most people already picture when they hear Florida retirement community. The Villages isn't governed by one community development district. It runs on a stack of more than 25 of them. 16 residential districts, 4 commercial districts, and several independent utility districts. Each one is a legitimate government in its own right, with its own board, its own budget, and its own slice of the community to manage. That layering is a deliberate structural choice, not an accident of paperwork. Splitting a single massive development into districts by phase lets the developer issue a separate bond for each section as it's built, and each bond carries its own repayment schedule tied specifically to that section's assessable land. It also means governance can hand off to residents district by district as each phase fills up. Nobody has to wait for the entire sprawling community to reach some single population threshold all at once. In the Villages specifically, these districts don't stop at roads and drainage. Their authority reaches into water and wastewater service, sanitation, and fire and emergency medical response through the Village's Public Safety Department, which is where that earlier line comes back. Policing still belongs to the county sheriffs because law enforcement is a power Chapter 190 never handed over. But everything short of that line shows how far this legal tool can stretch when a community gets built at this scale. Put all of it together and the picture becomes concrete instead of abstract. A resident who moves into a finished section of the Villages steps into a community where the roads were paved, the water lines were laid, the drainage was engineered, and the recreation centers were staffed. All of it happened before that resident ever toured a model home. None of it happened the way an ordinary town grows, block by block, over 50 years, funded by people who were already living there. It happened because a specific legal and financial machine, chartered under a 1980 state law, built it first and financed it through bonds that residents would spend decades paying down. That's the mechanism behind the postcard. A government most residents never think to look up, doing exactly what state law built it to do. But a machine built entirely on projected growth only holds up as long as the growth actually shows up on schedule. Florida has already run the experiment where it didn't. The same design that makes this system work is also its biggest weak point. The bonds of a CDD are secured only by assessments on land inside that specific district, not by the county's credit and not by the city's. The entire repayment plan depends on new homes actually getting built and sold on schedule. When that slows down, there are fewer lots generating assessment revenue, and the debt payments don't slow down to match. Florida found out exactly how much that mattered after the 2008 housing downturn. Research from Florida State University's Leroy Collins Institute looked at the CDDs operating at the time. It found that close to 40% of them were under some degree of financial distress once the downturn hit development statewide. That figure describes that specific period, not necessarily where things stand today, but it shows how exposed the model can be when growth stalls. The scale of the fallout backs that up. More than 200 Florida CDD bonds went into default in the years tied to that downturn, according to reporting that tracks distressed municipal debt nationally. Developers who couldn't finish the communities they'd started walked away from projects still carrying assessment obligations. That left districts, and in some cases the residents who had already moved in, holding infrastructure debt for a build-out that never finished on schedule. Researchers who studied the wave of distress afterward pushed for clearer reporting standards and better public awareness tools. The goal was letting a resident or a buyer actually see a district's financial health without digging through bond disclosures themselves, which is the trade sitting underneath every version of this system, stated plainly rather than dressed up in either direction. Same mechanism, two outcomes. The one that lets a retirement community open with finished roads, working drainage, and staffed amenities on day one can also leave residents holding decades of assessments if the growth behind it doesn't materialize the way the original bond schedule assumed it would. Most community development districts never default. Some do. And which kind a given district is, developer-controlled and still building, or resident-run and financially settled, is entirely knowable. The meetings are open and the records are public to anyone willing to look before they sign a closing document. A community development district is the reason a Florida retirement community can look completely finished on the day it opens, and the reason the bill for that finish keeps arriving for decades afterward. Roads before residents, bonds before buyers, a government built to eventually hand itself over. Once you can see that sequence, you start seeing it everywhere, running underneath most of the master-planned Florida you drive past without a second thought.